Hey there. You're listening to True Story No Cap. Real stories, no exaggeration, no lies. Just the raw, unfiltered moments life throws our way. Relax, lean back, and let's get started. In a small room, wallpapered with faded yellow floral paper, there were two people. A woman of short stature, with graying hair and a face as if carved from stone. Her nose had a hump like a bird of prey, her lips were thin, sharply defined. On her chest, bouncing with every sharp exhale, sparkled a massive, heavy necklace as she dropped sharp, stinging words. Dave, do you grasp that we are no longer able to drag out such an existence? The woman asked, sharply lifting her head. She is an impediment to us. The man looked at his mother, and in his gaze, stubbornness and guilt mingled. The soft features of his face became utterly pitiful. His hands hung limply by his sides, and his eyes avoided a direct gaze, fixed anywhere but on his parent. She's my wife, Mom. Why can't you understand that? The woman threw up her hands and emitted a short, contemptuous sound. Oh, don't start on about wife to me. You wouldn't be straying if she meant anything to you, and I have no intention of cleaning up after her. She's like a vegetable, and you heard what the doctor said? She has no more than a year left. What's the point of doing anything at all? I suppose she'll be perfectly fine at her grandmother's house. She'll remember her homeland and childhood. David shook his head vaguely. Besides, a decent inheritance will remain from her after her death. That will improve our situation. So? David looked thoughtfully at his mother and sighed heavily. The next day, all the bags and suitcases with Sarah Miller's belongings, David Miller's wife, were packed. Eleanor Miller, the girl's mother-in-law, put them out in the corridor, smirking crookedly at the sight of her bewildered daughter-in-law. Sarah Miller was a fragile, pretty girl with light hair, now confined to a wheelchair. At 27, she was suddenly struck by a stroke, rendering her disabled. Sarah Miller lost not only the ability to move, but also the gift of speech. Her days passed in almost constant silence, sitting in her chair. Eleanor Miller looked after her daughter-in-law, while David Miller disappeared at work in the insurance company. Sometimes Sarah Miller felt that her husband deliberately stayed late, just to avoid returning to his helpless wife, who couldn't even get to the bathroom on her own. It must be said that Eleanor Miller had never felt any particular affection for her daughter-in-law. She didn't like Sarah Miller's ambitions and desire for achievement. The mother-in-law believed that a girl should be a support to her husband, not spend whole days away on the affairs of the firm where she worked. Sarah Miller held the position of assistant to the general director of a large company. Over time, the girl dreamed of a promotion and a permanent position, and ideally, her own business. However, for now, she had neither the means nor decent opportunities for this. The stroke eradicated any remnants of sympathy for her daughter-in-law and Eleanor Miller. If before she merely tormented the girl with nagging, after what happened, she constantly lashed out at her with shouts. She could not stand Sarah Miller's silent requests and often forgot about her medicine or lunch. Only one thing pleased her. Sarah Miller could not speak and did not prevent her mother-in-law from rereading the plays in which she had once shown on the theater stage. While David Miller dragged the heavy suitcases to the car, Sarah Miller sat opposite the door, watching what was happening with silent horror. Her eyes were red, she could barely hold back tears. Don't worry, Eleanor Miller smirked. Your doctor said your heart is weak, you won't last long, and the air in the village is good. Maybe you'll live out this year. A little house in the village. Surely you never dreamed of returning there? Countless thoughts swarmed in Sarah Miller's head, but she could not express a single one. Her hands rested limply on her knees. If she could, she would have squeezed the fabric of her sweatpants with all her might, and then loudly screamed at her mother-in-law everything she thought about that old gray hag. Davy, darling, why are you taking so long? The breathless man climbed the stairs, breathing heavily. It was clear that the climb was difficult for him. He looked at his mother, holding out his hand. The elevator was broken there. I had to drag all this from the 20th floor. Eleanor Miller threw up her hands and shook her head, looking reproachfully at her daughter-in-law. And I said we needed to hire a mover. Mom, you know perfectly well we don't have the money for that. Once I played in theaters every day, filling the halls, and Mikey would come after lectures to see me, the woman said dreamily. Could I have imagined then that I'd have to clean up diapers? Eleanor Miller looked at her daughter-in-law again and fell silent. A neighbor, Martha, walked along the landing. Good day, the neighbor nodded. Going somewhere? Eleanor Miller smiled broadly. Martha, dear, hello? Yes, we're taking Sally to a nursing home for rehabilitation. The doctor said it should help. That must be quite expensive, Martha shook her head. Oh, yes, very expensive, but we'll have to tighten our belts, the mother-in-law sighed. We can't leave our daughter-in-law without treatment. She's done so much for us. Martha dropped a couple more phrases and headed into her apartment. The smile and pitiful expression instantly disappeared from Eleanor Miller's face. She turned to her son and frowned. Let's hurry before the whole building knows about our plans. I told you we should have done this early in the morning. David Miller picked up a suitcase and snorted. Morning? It's freezing cold. It's autumn outside. Do you want me to freeze off all my limbs? The man asked, and without waiting for an answer, left the apartment, leaving his indignant mother behind. David Miller was the only and adored child in the family. Eleanor Miller and Michael Miller gave birth to him late in life and doted on him. A professor of law and a star of the dramatic theater put aside their affairs, dedicating themselves to raising their son. The result of such overprotection was a frail David Miller, who at almost 40 lived with his mother and held a low-paying job where his boss tormented him and his colleagues disliked him. Almost 40 minutes later, David Miller finished moving all the things and Sarah Miller herself. He seated the girl in the back seat, folding her wheelchair. Tears streamed from the girl's eyes. She was breathing heavily. Her gaze, full of misunderstanding and vague hope, was fixed on her husband. Sal, calm down, please, the man whispered softly, adjusting the seatbelt. A neighbor will look after you there. We'll pay her from your funds. Of course, Eleanor Miller interjected. David Miller shrugged and nodded. We're, not doing so well financially right now. So yes, from yours. You'll be better off there. Sarah Miller looked at her husband with an unblinking gaze, trying to find in his pale face at least a crumb of pity or reluctance to carry out what he had planned. However, there was nothing of the sort, only constant glances around, searching for someone who might see the crying girl and the man carrying her to the car. The car pulled away from David Miller and Sarah Miller's house exactly at noon. Eleanor Miller waved and went home to immerse herself again in her well-worn book of plays, imagining herself walking onto the stage, met by the applause of admiring art connoisseurs. David Miller sighed, increasing speed. He tried not to look in the rear-view mirror, where the swollen eyes of the girl sitting motionless in the back were reflected. Sal, you understand I have no other way? The man could swear the girl raised an eyebrow mockingly. However, wiping his glasses, he saw only his wife's impassive, stone-like face. My mother is trying for our good. She's right, I can't look after you constantly. I have work. She's not young anymore, so you'll be better off there. You'll have your own caretaker. You'll return to your grandmother's house, which you remembered so fondly in childhood, so... David Miller fell silent again, turning away from his wife's gaze, but he felt it on his back. It seemed to burn through his thin jacket and imprinted directly on his lungs, making him breathe faster. The journey to the village where Sarah Miller was to live was long. The hamlet turned out to be remote and almost abandoned. It had only a couple of streets with a small number of houses, one small shop in the very center, and an old medical post, closed several years ago due to lack of staff. A dark blue car stopped with a rumble at a small house with an overgrown garden and a leaning fence. The house itself, at least from the outside, looked quite habitable. The garden was full of ancient trees and thick grass, in places rising higher than the fence. In front of the window stood an old bench on two small stumps on which someone was lying. While David Miller was getting his wife out of the car, setting up her wheelchair and unloading her things, Sarah Miller watched, unblinking, the silhouette lying near the house of her long-deceased grandmother. The girl squinted but could not make out who it was. "Brenda!" David Miller shouted. From the bench, muttering something, a short woman with short hair rose. Staggering, she approached the gate. Her face was wrinkled and sagging, her hair tangled. A large crack was visible on her lip, and an old bruise adorned her eye. Brenda was dressed in completely mismatched clothes, a yellow t-shirt with some English inscriptions, green short trousers totally unsuitable for the weather, and pink worn-out shoes with rhinestones. "Mr. David," the woman exclaimed. "You're early?" Brenda said, stumbling over her words. David Miller frowned and turned to his wife. "This is your caretaker, Sal. Meet her. Her name is Brenda. She'll look after you now." In confirmation of her words, Brenda nodded and swayed. If Sarah Miller could, she would certainly have rolled her eyes. The situation seemed monstrously absurd and terrifyingly dreadful to her. David Miller unloaded all the suitcases from the car, even carried them into the house, and handed Brenda a thin envelope. It clearly didn't contain much, but judging by her appearance, it was enough for her. Then the man stopped in front of the wheelchair and sighed. "Sal, why are you so unhappy? I'm sure you're smiling inside. This is your childhood home." The man surveyed the overgrown area, the gate that fell apart in his hands, the fresh air, constant care. What more is needed for happiness? Sarah Miller wanted to name a million things that would make her happy. However, as usual, she remained silent, glaring angrily at her husband. Each of her glances carried more thoughts than anyone could express in words. David Miller understood this, and a small worm of conscience even stirred in his soul, but then his mother's words and the numbers on the bank card came to mind, and the worm fell silent, anticipating the taste of money. David Miller got into the car and waved to his wife through the window. Brenda approached her charge, waving to the man. "Don't worry, Mr. David, everything will be fine." The man forced another smile, and the car drove away from the ill-fated house, leaving Sarah Miller alone with the empty, overgrown building and a drunkard who reeked not only of alcohol, but of everything one could find in the village. A year later. "Dave, you seriously haven't visited your wife in—" Eleanor Miller glanced at the calendar. "In a year?" With horror in her voice, she continued, "Are you out of your mind, Dave? And who raised you like this? How do you know she hasn't died long ago, or, worse still, gotten out of her wheelchair?" David Miller tore himself away from the television and looked wearily at the football match. He had just returned from work and had accidentally let slip that he hadn't visited his wife once. Eleanor Miller was shocked and indignant. "Brenda calls me every week. Everything's fine there. I take her money every quarter. Calm down." Eleanor Miller snorted, walked over to the sofa where her son was lounging, snatched the remote, and turned off the cursed box. "When I'm talking to you, you should only look at me," the woman said loudly and with some theatricality, shaking her head with its elaborate high hairstyle. "Brenda? Who is that anyway? That same drunkard you left to look after your wife? Are you sure she's looking after her and not drinking away the money I give her? Maybe she hasn't visited Sarah Miller in ages while you lie here watching television?" David Miller felt uneasy. He rolled his eyes, fixing an empty gaze on the wall. "You want me to go see her tomorrow? Fine. I'll spend my only day off traveling to a remote village to see my half-dead wife. Yes, Mom, you really care about me." Snorting loudly, Eleanor Miller threw the TV remote at her son and left the room, quietly voicing everything she thought about him. The next day morning, David Miller packed a few things, took an envelope with money, and got into the car. He looked longingly at the clock face, which showed only 8 in the morning. The man could still be sleeping, but he had to go somewhere unknown and, most importantly, for some unknown reason. He considered his mother's fears groundless. However, since childhood, he was used to obeying her in everything and always. The journey was long, and as luck would have it, the radio broke. The silence in the car and the rare exclamations of intemperate drivers made the morning even worse. Just as he was approaching the village, a large black car with a pickup bed sped out toward the man. It was moving fast, clearly knowing the area. Behind the wheel sat a man who looked a few years younger than David Miller. He braked sharply at the sight of the slowly moving city car and quietly apologized, saying he didn't mean to. David Miller waved wearily, not wanting to get into an argument. The way to the house where Sarah Miller lived was vaguely remembered by the man. He used to give the money to Brenda in the district center, where she would come by bus specifically for the envelope. David Miller himself had only been to the village 3 times. Once when he took his wife there, the second time when he was looking for Brenda, and the third time when he was still dating Sarah Miller, and she showed him her childhood home, telling him that first her mother spent her childhood there, and then she herself. The dark blue car stopped next to an almost new fence. The grass in the garden was mown, but it had already grown significantly, as if it had been done a very long time ago, and overall the area looked neglected, as if no one had been there for a long time. David Miller frowned and got out of the car. He carefully opened the gate and called out to his wife, then to Brenda. Silence. No one answered. The man wanted to go into the house, but there was a huge padlock on the door, blocking the way. David Miller tugged at the door, but it didn't budge. He took out his phone and started calling Brenda, but she didn't answer. The man wearily rubbed his forehead and looked around the area. Brenda's house should have been nearby. He found her very close to the clothing store. At the time, it seemed like great luck, but now his mother's suspicions didn't seem so foolish. Brenda didn't inspire confidence. However, for some reason, David Miller still trusted her. Leaving the area of the little house, the man walked along the street to find Brenda's house. It looked even worse than Sarah Miller's house. David Miller went into it and held his nose. An unpleasant smell hit his nostrils. It was so strong that David Miller only had the strength to quickly look around the house. Brenda was not there, and he hurried outside, breathing deeply the fresh air. Having caught his breath, he looked up and saw a plump woman with 2 buckets walking by. "David Miller," he shouted and ran towards her. "Excuse me, do you know where Sarah Miller is?" The woman frowned. "She lived in that house," David Miller pointed. "And Brenda? Bren, the drunkard who was looking after her?" David Miller nodded affirmatively. "Well, then she's probably at Old Man Sam's. He lives at the end of the village. She buys moonshine from him, and who might you be?" "Never mind," David Miller waved dismissively. "Show me where Old Man Sam's house is." "And why not show you?" The woman pointed the way to the local moonshiner's house. Brenda was indeed inside. She was sitting at a huge round table and drinking a yellow liquid that emitted a pungent aroma in all directions. David Miller took Brenda by the arms and led her outside. "Where's Sarah Miller? Who's being cheeky?" Brenda asked loudly in a slurred voice. It seemed she was looking straight ahead and seeing nothing. "My wife, where is she, you drunken alcoholic?" "She lives not far from here," Brenda smirked, raising a hand that wouldn't obey her. "And what will I get for it?" David Miller angrily took his wallet from his pocket, pulled out a few bills, and shoved them at Brenda. She, businesslike, counted the money and nodded contentedly. Then she slipped out of the man's firm grip and flew back into Old Man Sam's house. She came out without the money, but with a large bottle of cloudy yellow liquid. "Let's go." The woman waved her hand and hobbled forward, trying not to fall. David Miller followed her. The woman led him out of the street. They walked for a long time along an empty road. The man thought Brenda had decided to confuse him, and he was about to yell at her, but in the distance the roof of an unknown house appeared. The closer David Miller and Brenda got, the more he was amazed by the size of the house compared to the other buildings in the village. It seemed simply enormous. 3 floors, a balcony, a huge garden in the backyard. Several cars and agricultural machinery were visible. Brenda stopped not far from the iron gate of the house and pointed straight ahead. "Here you go, sign for it." She nodded so hard her head almost came off and walked away, saying nothing more. David Miller was in shock at what he saw, so he didn't respond to the woman's words. He rang the small bell. A clear, joyful voice sounded. "Nick, why are you so early?" David Miller was taken aback, freezing in place for a second. "Sal?" he quietly repeated. The voice on the other side fell silent and then sighed deeply. "Davy, come in." The door swung open, revealing a huge garden and a stone path lined with lush flowering plants to David Miller. Stepping carefully along the path, David Miller went inside. On the steps of the house stood a short, petite girl with light hair. She was wearing a beige suit and a shawl. She looked down at her husband from above. Her face was almost impenetrable, like a frozen mask. "I thought you wouldn't show up," the girl smirked. "But come in, since you're here." David Miller was speechless. He simply followed his wife slowly as she walked confidently through the house. Inside, the house was simply furnished, but with taste. Pleasant colors, beautiful decorations and paintings, soft, clean carpets. One of the doors led to a small office with a computer and a desk piled high with papers. "Oh, don't look there. We've had a complete mess with papers lately. We need to sort it out better." David Miller didn't understand anything but shifted his gaze to his wife, who looked even better than before the stroke. A healthy blush covered her pale face. Shine gleamed on her crimson lips and her eyes were lightly lined. Nothing excessive, but it seemed David Miller had never seen such beauty. Sarah Miller led the man into a large room with sofas and armchairs. "I'll make some tea and we'll talk." Sarah Miller went to the kitchen, and David Miller was left alone in the room. He sank into an armchair, unable to tear his gaze away from the beauty of the room. Paintings, sofas, flowers, carpets. It all seemed unreal. The man even pinched himself to make sure it was real. He couldn't believe that he had expected to see a sick wife in a wheelchair, and before him stood a beauty he had never seen before. Sarah Miller returned a couple of minutes later with a large tray holding several cups of tea. She handed one cup to her husband and took the second for herself, sitting down neatly opposite him. "Didn't expect this?" she asked softly. The man shook his head. "I also didn't expect that for money my beloved husband would send me to die." "I thought—" "Keep your meaningless excuses to yourself," Sarah Miller asked him. "I know everything about you, my dear. You're too bad at hiding the truth. It's all about my inheritance. When I received the will from my grandmother in Germany, I was incredibly happy, imagining the life we would have together now, but then I saw something that made me change my mind." "What?" David Miller stammered. He held the hot cup of tea in his hands as if not noticing the pain, and looked directly into his wife's face, hoping to see something there that would help him understand what was happening. "Remember my friend?" Sarah Miller asked. "Kathy, we worked together at the firm." David Miller nodded. "She was the one who advised me to change my life a year and a half ago." Tall, stately Catherine sat in an armchair in a small restaurant where their boss had sent them for negotiations that had already concluded. "Dinner's paid for, why not splurge?" Sarah Miller smirked, settling comfortably opposite Catherine. Catherine was Sarah Miller's colleague. She worked at the same firm, was a few years older than her, and held the position of department head. She always wore strict suits, had a very definite opinion on many issues, especially regarding finances. Sarah Miller opened a small handbag, took out an envelope, and handed it to her friend. "Look, what do you think? Is it real?" Catherine opened the envelope with interest and read the letter. It was a letter from Germany. "Who is Anna Reuter?" "My grandmother," Sarah Miller replied, "on my father's side. She married a German when my father was about 6 or 7, and they went to live there. Then Dad returned to Russia and met Mom. The last time I saw my grandmother was at my father's funeral. She offered me to go with her." "And why didn't you agree?" Catherine asked in surprise. "Was I supposed to abandon Davy? He has his mother here, his job, and I never dreamed of going abroad." Catherine looked at her colleague with incomprehension. "You're incorrigible, Sal, trading a good life in Germany for a man." Sarah Miller rolled her eyes. She knew her friend's opinion regarding her husband perfectly well and preferred not to listen to her. Catherine was always very sharp in her remarks, thanks to which she had a good career progression and few friends. They all scattered from her directness. "Your Davy would be ready to sell his own mother for money. Do you even know how much your grandmother left you?" "There was a letter attached," Sarah Miller replied. "She wrote that I was her last relative and she was leaving part of the inheritance to her husband's children and part to me. Judging by the letter, it's a very decent amount, as well as a small share in an estate in Germany." "Do you need to go there to get it?" Catherine asked. "There's an instruction on what to do. You can accept the inheritance in Russia. The notary will come here himself." A waiter approached, bringing the food. The girls ordered a salad and a glass of wine each. "I can imagine how happy Davy will be. He always dreamed of money, of his own business." "You dream too," Catherine noted, waving her fork. "And unlike him, you have the opportunity to run one." "Don't talk about Davy like that. He's a good person. He's just unlucky." Catherine laughed loudly. "Yes, and most of all, he's unlucky with his mother. Not a mother-in-law, but I still don't understand why you live with her when you could move out." Sarah Miller shrugged. "Eleanor Miller can't live alone. She's not used to it, and it's not that hard for me to tolerate her." Catherine grumbled discontentedly and sipped her wine. "I don't advise talking about the inheritance. They'll either send you to the next world for that money, or they'll start fawning over you and take every penny." Sarah Miller slammed her palm on the table and looked threateningly at her friend. "Davy and I love each other. Nothing like that will happen. Don't stir things up. You have too low an opinion of my family. Really?" The conversation ended in nothing. That same evening, Sarah Miller came home, told her family about the inheritance, showing the envelope. The girl had never seen them so happy. That evening, Eleanor Miller uncorked a bottle of expensive wine, and for David Miller, despite their constant economizing, she ordered food delivery to celebrate. Sarah Miller felt that her life was starting to get better. A few weeks later, Sarah Miller was walking down the street, smiling at everything around her. Life at home had improved. Eleanor Miller stopped nagging her. David Miller started coming home from work earlier and spending more time with his wife. Sarah Miller was sure that her life had become better and would always be like this from now on. The girl decided to stop by a men's clothing store. She wanted to buy her husband a new tie as a gift. He was tired of all his old ones. Sarah Miller was absorbed in looking at the window and didn't notice anything around her. Then she turned her head and saw David Miller. She wanted to call out to him, but then she noticed a girl walking towards him. The man hugged her and kissed her. From the unexpected blow to her gut, Sarah Miller stumbled and leaned on the display window to keep her balance. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Sarah Miller didn't make a scene. She simply went home and went to bed early, thinking about what had happened before falling asleep. The next morning, the girl took a day off from work and went to the local detective agency. A short, thin man in glasses sat at a small table. He was reading a newspaper and drinking coffee. Sarah Miller sat down opposite him and explained the situation. "What exactly do you need?" "Everything," Sarah Miller said. "How did they meet? How long have they been seeing each other? Their words, actions, meeting places? I want to know everything." The man whistled but said nothing. He seemed surprised by the girl's eagerness. However, he preferred to remain silent so as not to lose a client. For a whole week, Sarah Miller was in limbo. She couldn't bring herself to tell Catherine the truth, not wanting to hear her say she was right. But she had to admit, Catherine had indeed been right. It was as if she had always seen through David Miller, disapproving of their relationship. She refused to be a witness at the wedding, which greatly hurt Sarah Miller. Soon they made up, but the girl still felt a lingering resentment. Only now did she begin to understand her friend, who had only wanted to reach her. A week later, Sarah Miller sat alone in a small coffee shop drinking cold coffee. She was thinking about what was happening. She couldn't put together a coherent picture in her mind. The girl had always tried for her husband, doing everything he or his mother asked. She had even swallowed her pride, curbing her ambitions. A phone call interrupted her thoughts. The detective asked her to come. Throwing a bill onto the table, Sarah Miller grabbed her bag and hurried to the agency. Thankfully, it was nearby. She rushed inside and sat down opposite the man, who, as before, was reading a newspaper and drinking coffee. He looked up at his client and adjusted his slipping glasses. "You know, you're lucky your husband's mistress turned out to be so talkative." "Really?" Sarah Miller asked, not wanting to hear the answer to her question. But the man nodded anyway. "I had to follow her for almost a week, interview her friends, but I found out everything. Her name is Lily Johnson. She's 22, a graduate of a pedagogical university. They met your husband a few months ago on the street, I think." "Thank you for the information. What about facts like videos or—" The detective, smiling broadly, reached into a desk drawer and pulled out a huge, old-fashioned voice recorder. Sarah Miller was genuinely surprised at the sight. She hadn't seen such devices since childhood. It seemed they weren't made anymore. Turning something, the man turned on a loud, sometimes crackling recording. "Davy," a clear female voice exclaimed, "is this for me? Oh, gods, how beautiful. Expensive, I bet?" "I spare no expense for you," David Miller said in a pleased voice. "Once I open my business, I can make you happy with trinkets every day." "And when—" "Davy," the girl repeated, "you said you don't have money for your business yet?" There were no sounds, but Sarah Miller was ready to swear that David Miller smiled broadly. "My wife does. She recently inherited from her grandmother. We'll open a business with her money and live well." "You'll leave her, won't you?" Lily said as if through pouted lips. "As soon as she's no longer useful to me." "Yes," David Miller said loudly. And the recording continued. The man and the girl said something. However, Sarah Miller was no longer listening to them. She was lost in her thoughts, sitting with a perfectly straight back and looking straight ahead. She remembered meeting her husband and how happy she was when he proposed to her. Sarah Miller was 11 years younger than David Miller. They met when she was finishing her economics degree. He invited her to cozy cafes, walked in the park under the stars, bought tickets to the theater and concerts. Eleanor Miller then seemed very sweet and kind. Sarah Miller, who had recently lost her mother, fell in love with the intellectual family and was ready to marry the not-so-rich and shy David Miller. Catherine was against it, but Sarah Miller didn't listen. She was consumed by new feelings. Memories of choosing a wedding suit with Davy and of sorting gifts after the ceremony, counting which relatives gave more, surfaced in the girl's mind. At that time, the girl was incredibly happy. She was sure she would always be this happy. Despite the fact that David Miller wasn't at all happy about her dreams of business and a career, he, and more so his mother, wanted a family and children. The girl wasn't ready for that. She wanted more. Now all her dreams and hopes for a life together collapsed in an instant. Davy, the very same Davy who had never raised his voice at his wife, was contemplating how he would use Sarah Miller's money to open a business and leave her. It seemed so wild that the girl sat staring blankly at the wall for several minutes. The detective didn't interfere. He had seen worse reactions. This was the most normal. Once, one crazy wife simply broke his window in a fit of rage at her husband. At the time, it seemed wild, the ultimate degree of disappointment and anger. But now he looked into the girl's eyes and saw all-consuming hatred and pain that affected even him. The man got up and went to get water for his client. Sarah Miller drank the water in one gulp and then remembered her friend's words about David Miller being ready to sell his own mother for money. The girl hadn't believed Catherine then, but now it seemed true. A malicious grin appeared on the girl's intelligent face, and the detective recoiled. He had never seen such an expression before. Several months later. David Miller's dark blue car drove away from the leaning fence, behind which Sarah Miller remained. Her wheelchair was held by Brenda. However, she was more holding onto the wheelchair than holding it. As soon as the car disappeared from sight, Sarah Miller stood up. Brenda's eyes widened, staring at her charge, who had simply gotten up from her wheelchair after a stroke. "Brenda, let's make a deal. I'll pay you the same amount my husband pays, and you won't tell him what you saw." Brenda nodded, dumbfounded, unable to ask questions. She was still holding onto the wheelchair. "Excellent. We'll be great friends. Here's your first installment." Sarah Miller held out a few bills. "You'll come every month and I'll give you money. In turn, you must report to your husband that my condition hasn't changed and he doesn't need to visit. Clear?" The woman nodded, snatched the bills, and walked away without saying goodbye, while Sarah Miller headed into the house to change. Inside the old house, everything was covered in dust. The furniture was draped with cloth and trash was strewn everywhere. One window was even broken. Perhaps children had tried to climb in. Sarah Miller walked over to the old red sofa, threw off the cloth, and sank onto it wearily. A cloud of dust rose around her. The girl took out her phone from her pocket, which Eleanor Miller had miraculously not found, and dialed the only number she could trust. "Come, everything happened exactly as you said. Yes, the house in the village. I'm waiting." Throwing the phone aside, Sarah Miller lay down. A multitude of thoughts swarmed in her head. She thought about everything and nothing at the same time. An hour and a half later, when Sarah Miller had already cleaned the house, changed clothes, and prepared food, the door opened and a tall girl in a strict blue suit entered. In her hands was a small bag, wine, and takeout food. "Scrambled eggs don't appeal to me," Catherine smirked, nodding at the old dirty frying pan, covered with such a thick layer of grease that it was probably impossible to wash off. "Good thing you brought wine. I definitely wouldn't have gotten through this day without it." Catherine looked around the little house and nodded to herself. Then her gaze fell on a package of diapers, and she shook her head. "You sat in this— oh God, this is horribly disgusting." "Yes, I can't disagree. But you know what bothered me more?" Sarah Miller asked, taking dishes from the cabinets. "What?" Catherine was wiping the table and arranging the food containers. "Eleanor Miller only changed my diaper once a day. It was as if she didn't notice that I was using the toilet. She was so engrossed in her novels that she didn't hear me getting up and walking around the house." Catherine laughed. "If you had left the house for a few days, she definitely wouldn't have noticed. The main thing is to put an album with her photos next to her." "Exactly," Sarah Miller sighed, sitting down at the table. "I still can't believe they left me to die. And they believed a hastily concocted diagnosis. They heard I didn't have long to live and started rejoicing. How could they possibly question the reality of the diagnosis given by Peter?" Catherine and Sarah Miller began to eat, discussing their future plans. "I'll live here for a month or two until I figure out how to live on. I have zero plans for the future, for the first time in my life. I have no plans at all." "And what are you going to do here?" Catherine asked. "An old abandoned house, an overgrown garden, a remote village. You and such a place are incompatible. If I rush headlong into things now, I'll definitely fail. It's not the right state of mind," Sarah Miller explained. "You see, I gave up on my business dreams a long time ago. All the groundwork, ideas are long gathering dust somewhere in the depths of the apartment, and, it seems to me, everything is long outdated. I'll live here, relax, maybe I'll come up with something. I haven't had a vacation in a long time." Catherine shrugged, not knowing what to say to her friend. For the first time, she too was speechless. She didn't like David Miller, without knowing why. She acted foolishly by refusing to be a witness. However, she didn't think he was capable of such a thing. She had joked, saying he was ready to sell his own mother. To her, David Miller seemed like a spineless guy, incapable of anything but processing insurance. But he was able to leave a person to die, and not just any person, but his wife. It seemed like some kind of madness. Catherine spent the first night with her friend in that house and went home the next morning. Sarah Miller quit her job, but Catherine didn't, and she didn't have a rich inheritance from her grandmother. Sarah Miller started the new day with a cold shower. Fortunately, her grandmother's house had water and even gas. Her parents had installed all the amenities in the house once, but soon after she died, never fully being able to use them. The cold shower managed to refresh her cluttered mind a little, and Sarah Miller took a deep breath, feeling the icy drops of water hitting her back. 3 weeks of living in hell were behind her. She had put her husband to the test. She had hoped to see at least a drop of care or love from him, but in the end she received only hatred and the expectation of her speedy death. This was the worst of all. Therefore, Sarah Miller could not quickly return to her old rhythm. Her accustomed life was over. She needed to perk up. She took out the money she had hidden from her suitcase when no one was looking. The girl went to the shop. She vaguely remembered its location and decided to ask the villagers. Thankfully, it was early morning and everyone was either going to work or to their gardens. It was autumn, the weather was cool outside, especially in the morning, and Sarah Miller wrapped herself more snugly in an old coat she found in the closet. She managed to find the shop without help from passers-by. It was exactly the same as 20 years ago. The girl smirked at the sight of the familiar, colorful sign, and the cloudy window through which she could see the counters and a plump saleswoman in a blue apron. Entering inside, Sarah Miller inhaled the familiar smell of fresh bread and the lemonade the saleswoman loved. The woman's name was Valerie. When Sarah Miller was little, she was just starting to work here. Now she was probably in charge of the shop. "Mrs. Valerie, hello. Do you recognize me?" Sarah Miller asked. The woman thought for a moment. "Something looks familiar, but I just can't remember." "I'm Margaret Brown's granddaughter. I was here as a child." "Oh, Sally, how could I not recognize you?" the woman exclaimed, coming out from behind the counter. She hugged Sarah Miller, kissing her on the cheek. "You haven't been here for so long, and nothing has changed for us." "I noticed. Will you sell me some groceries?" Sarah Miller asked, looking at the counters. They were filled with food, although the shop seemed very small. The girl checked the prices and realized they were even higher than in the city. "The prices are enormous." Valerie threw up her hands. "Give me a loaf each of black and white bread, a bottle of milk, butter, and vegetable oil, a kilogram each of pasta, buckwheat, rice, and peas, cheese, sugar, salt, and, oh, Sally, go get your dairy from Mrs. Peterson. She lives right next door to you. And this milk?" The woman nodded at the counter. "It's shameful to give it to a cat. It has a shelf life of 6 months. Where have you ever seen milk last that long? For vegetables, potatoes, onions, beets, carrots, go see James. Everything here is from a local farmer, but it's been sitting for a long time. Almost everyone in the village has their own gardens, and James always sells cheaply. Ask for directions, he's not far from the shop." Valerie fell silent. Her words were interrupted by the bell and a man who burst into the shop. He was dressed in dirty clothes. His face was very serious. He pushed Sarah Miller away from the counter and said loudly, "Valerie, give me 2 bottles of mineral water, and someone was supposed to leave an order for you here. A box of medicines and poison for pests. We need to plant before winter soon, and there's nothing to treat with." "Nicholas, don't you see there's a customer here?" Valerie asked strictly. Nicholas Smith glanced at the girl and waved her away. She's from the city. If she needs it so badly, let her buy it there. I need it urgently. Nicholas. Valerie looked at him strictly. Sarah Miller raised her hand in a conciliatory gesture. Let him go, Mrs. Valerie. He seems to need it more. Valerie looked displeased but went to get the box. Couldn't that have waited just a few minutes? The man was tall, dark-haired. His hands were calloused from work, and his gaze was stern. Sarah Miller hadn't seen people like that since childhood. Despite his working, slightly untidy appearance, Nicholas Smith was quite handsome and a young man. He was clearly over 30, but definitely not more than 40. He looked at the girl, squinting. And is it so important to you? The man asked rudely. I'm not in a hurry, of course, but even in the city, people queue, and believe me, they're in a lot more of a hurry than you are. Sarah Miller smirked and turned away, feeling the man's piercing brown eyes on her. Valerie came out with a heavy box and handed it to the customer. Take it. The mineral water is over there. She nodded towards the far corner, where mineral water was indeed stacked in plastic packs. You'll pay later, right? Nicholas Smith nodded, picked up 2 bottles of mineral water, and left the shop without saying goodbye. Who was that? Sarah Miller asked Valerie. The woman waved her hand and went to the shelf with cereals. Local farmer. He inherited a small house and livestock from his father about 8 years ago. He decided to start a farm, built everything himself, did it, hired workers, makes ends meet as best he can. He wants to plant fields, but for now, he only plants large gardens and sells produce in our shop and in neighboring villages. He's not a bad guy, just a bit rude. Nobody knows why. Sarah Miller picked up several bags of groceries and carried them home. They were heavy and she barely made it, but the small refrigerator at home no longer looked so empty. Then the girl went to get vegetables and dairy products from the people Valerie had recommended. Although the girl was used to buying everything in the shop in the city, in the village it was cheaper and better to buy from ordinary people. James lived indeed not far from the shop. He had a large plot of land and 2 goats that bleated loudly at the sight of Sarah Miller. As a child, the girl was afraid of animals, so she avoided them now. In the house, Sarah Miller found an old man who was making some kind of chair. The girl explained the situation and introduced herself. Sally, I'm so happy to meet you. The old man smiled through his thick gray beard. There haven't been young people in the village for so long. You're the first in many years. And Margot's granddaughter. I only remember her daughter, Natalie. Yes, that's my mother, the girl nodded. But so, will you sell me some vegetables? I can give you some apples for change, too, James smiled. They're good, ripe, juicy, and will keep well for winter, and for compote's jam. Will you take some? Sarah Miller smiled happily. However, the smile left her face when she left the old man's house with 3 huge bags that weighed twice as much as the previous ones. James decided to sell her enough produce for a month and a half, apparently thinking the girl would only eat potatoes and beets. Sarah Miller felt uncomfortable refusing, so she sacrificed her back, which definitely couldn't handle the load. After walking just a couple of steps, Sarah Miller stopped, heavily placing the bags on the ground. A black car with a large pickup bed stopped not far from her. Need help? Hearing a familiar voice, Sarah Miller looked up and saw Nicholas Smith examining the girl's bags. Remembering the man's words in the shop, the girl started to think. She didn't want to ride with a person who didn't know how to be polite, but she also didn't want to drag the huge bags. So she had to swallow her pride again. Yes, that wouldn't hurt. Nicholas Smith got out of the car and picked up the bags. You really stocked up. Are you planning to winter here? No, making compote, frying potatoes. The girl smirked and picked up a smaller bag, helping to load it into the pickup bed. Nicholas Smith turned around and took the bag from the girl's hands. Sarah Miller felt his warm touch and froze for a second. Then she released the rough fabric and stepped back a few paces. Nicholas Smith placed the bag down and closed the pickup bed. Show me the way, where to take you. Of course I'll show you, Sarah Miller said, getting into the passenger seat. Someone like you from the city? Well, yes, Sarah Miller said thoughtfully. And what attracted you here? I grew up here, Sarah Miller shrugged, and then I had problems at home and needed somewhere to be alone. I remembered this little house. I always loved this village. It's quiet and peaceful. Nothing interferes with thinking. Yes, that's true. Nicholas Smith drove fast. Either he was in a hurry or it was just his driving style. However, he wasn't slow only when driving. In the shop or on the street, he also didn't linger, so Sarah Miller decided it was his characteristic trait. The bags were unloaded and even carried into the house. Nicholas Smith walked through the grass that reached his waist. It had already started to dry, so it rustled loudly underfoot. Is there really no one to mow? Grandmother did it herself almost until her death. She could do literally everything, from cutting and sewing to mowing and fixing the roof. And I'm a city softie. Almost none of the women in the village know how to mow, even with an electric trimmer. Equality hasn't reached here, Nicholas Smith smirked. You're from the city, right? Yes, the man replied and glanced at his watch. Look at the time, I should be going. And what's your name? Sarah Miller, the girl introduced herself. Beautiful name. Nice to meet you, Sarah Miller. Nice to meet you too, Nicholas Smith, the girl smiled. Nicholas Smith left, leaving the girl alone. Sarah Miller watched the departing car for a long time, trying to understand the motives of this man. The next morning began with a rumble and a strange rustling sound. Sarah Miller, tossing and turning, got up from the creaky bed and went to the window. Outside, in the middle of the overgrown grass, stood Nicholas Smith with an old scythe. The grass lay in neat rows under Nicholas Smith's movements. It was clear he was sweating, despite the cool morning weather. Sarah Miller threw open the window and called out to the man. Nicholas Smith looked back, stopping his mowing. He was breathing deeply, looking at the open window and the girl looking at him. Sarah Miller was wearing only a long linen dress she had found in the closet and decided to use as a nightgown. After cleaning the house and cooking, the girl was quite exhausted. She had no time left to unpack, so she wore what she found in her grandmother's closet. What are you doing? Nicholas Smith raised his eyebrows, silently expressing his opinion of the foolish question. I understand you're mowing, but why are you doing it at my house? Do you want me to stop? Nicholas Smith asked, looking at the girl slightly mockingly. Sarah Miller shook her head and closed the window, not wanting to continue the conversation. Besides, she noticed the man's gaze. He was clearly looking her over. To avoid such situations repeating, the girl changed clothes and went to the small kitchen. Sarah Miller decided to make pancakes. Of course, she never got up this early and didn't want to cook anything. Moreover, the fast-paced city rhythm had taught her not to eat breakfast, but she had to feed the unexpected helper who decided to come to her house early in the morning and work. When Nicholas Smith finished, which was clear from the cessation of the scythe sound, the pancakes were already ready. Sarah Miller was just finishing frying the last one. The girl went out onto the porch and called out to the helper. Come in for breakfast. The man shrugged, put down the scythe, and entered the house. He was all sweaty and tired. You can use the shower. Sarah Miller nodded towards the bathroom and went into the kitchen. Nicholas Smith didn't take the hostess's offer, only washed his face. He came into the kitchen and sat at the table. Before him was a plate of pancakes and sour cream. Sarah Miller stood next to the table, arms crossed. How much do I owe you? Nicholas Smith raised his eyebrows in a question mark. Well, you didn't do it for free, did you? For the food? The man smirked and took a bite of a pancake. Leaning back in his chair, he looked directly into the girl's eyes, as if wanting to read something in them. Well, if you don't want to accept payment, I won't insist, Sarah Miller shrugged. I'm used to any work being paid for. And haven't you heard of help in the city? Sarah Miller snorted and laughed. You yourself said you're from the city. Mrs. Valerie told me you've lived here for 8 years, which means you can't reproach me. I'm not reproaching you. City people are just always surprised when they're helped for free. I used to be like that too. And why aren't you eating, by the way? Nicholas Smith asked, tilting his head. He was looking at the girl with interest. I don't eat breakfast, the girl waved dismissively. I always had to go to work early. I'm not used to it. I usually snacked at work. And what did you do for work? Nicholas Smith asked, tilting his head. Assistant to the general director of a firm. Nicholas Smith whistled and smiled. It's surprising that after that you ended up here. He gestured around the small house with worn wallpaper. Don't think I was raking in money with a shovel, only with a child's scoop, if anything. A very small child's scoop. But I liked it. I was learning about running a business and I had a dream. Then, then, then I had a stroke, the girl chuckled. But I'll tell you that story some other time. I still need to clean the house and the attic today. Besides, my friend promised to come in the evening. A busy life, you know. Nicholas Smith smiled in response to her words. I should be going too, anyway. Nicholas Smith finished his breakfast and left Sarah Miller's house. She watched him go again with a long gaze, trying to understand this man's motives. In the evening of the same day, Catherine arrived. She brought some things Sarah Miller had asked for. Catherine whistled, seeing the mown and tidy yard. She put down her bags and called out to her friend, who was wiping the cloudy windows at that moment. I need to replace the glass. Where do you think I can find a handyman? She asked without greeting her. Catherine smirked. Ask the man who mowed the whole yard for you. That was Nicholas Smith, the local farmer. He gave me a ride yesterday. I don't think he has time for glass. Sarah Miller waved it off. Well, he found time for the grass, Catherine shrugged. What farmer? Sarah Miller stopped rubbing the glass. She invited her friend into the house. If you don't mind, peel the potatoes. They're under the sink. I can't do anything anymore. I'm tired. Sarah Miller sank onto a chair and wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. Catherine took off her jacket and picked up a knife. So what about the farmer? I didn't know him before. He came here 8 years ago. My grandmother died around that time. He keeps a farm. He has various animals, gardens. What else can I say about him? Rich? Kathy, the girl reproached. What? Catherine protested. In our time, that's very important. Well, fine. How is he as a man? Sarah Miller thought for a moment. I don't even know. He's kind of ambiguous. First, he was rude to me in the shop, and then he decided it was a good idea to give me a ride, and he even came in the morning to mow the grass, although I didn't ask him to, and then he refused to take money. Maybe he likes you? Don't be silly, Sarah Miller waved dismissively. He thinks I'm a city fool, as far as I can tell. Take a closer look at him. Maybe for once in your life you'll have a normal man who knows what it means to be a man. Sarah Miller rolled her eyes but said nothing to that. How are things at work? Oh, don't ask. Without you, our boss has gone completely mad. He's already changed his assistant 3 times. He can't do anything. It turns out you did more than we all thought. Sarah Miller had been living in the village for a month. She had gotten used to the small house and the quiet life, and she had also gotten used to resting, and that annoyed her terribly. The girl had worked all her life. She grew up in a not very wealthy family and started working right after studying. She didn't take days off without special reasons and was always on time for work, and now she had done almost nothing for a month. Yes, Sarah Miller spent the first week on the house trying to bring it into a habitable state, scrubbing everything around. But then silence and peace set in. The girl woke up late, read books Catherine brought, visited the old women, and listened to their stories from their youth. Besides, Sarah Miller couldn't shake the thought that she constantly ran into Nicholas Smith. On the day Catherine came, he overheard the conversation about the glass and came to replace it the next morning. Sarah Miller fed him fritters. Then he fixed the gate and the girl cooked him breakfast again. This happened several more times and it became a habit. Sarah Miller was no longer surprised by the early rumble outside and the presence of a man under her window, and Nicholas Smith, as usual, would come into the house and sit down at the table. There were almost no long and meaningful conversations between them. He didn't give her flowers, didn't give compliments, he just was. He was there. It seemed very strange. Sarah Miller desperately wanted to understand his motives. Confess, Nicholas Smith, do you just come here to eat? I didn't say that, the man smirked, turning away from the dripping faucet. Most of their conversations were like this, short, not very meaningful, and usually joking. Rumors circulated in the village, and some girl from the farm even came to Sarah Miller, threatening her. Nicholas Smith is mine, understood? The plump brunette said menacingly. You think you came here from your city and can snatch our men? No way. The stranger angrily tore a leaf from a tree and threw it at the startled Sarah Miller, who was standing on the porch. When Nicholas Smith came the next time, she told him about his admirer. Were you scared? The man smirked, but there seemed to be a hint of seriousness in his words. I haven't been scared of village women yet. Big grown men threatened me when I worked at a big firm. Once, instead of my boss, I refused to sign a contract with a firm, and they almost beat me right there. 5 grown men in suits, and I was alone. That's scary. Not a leaf thrown by some crazy admirer of a man who, for some reason unknown to me, fixes everything that breaks in my house. Nicholas Smith smiled and fell silent. You're a man of few words, aren't you? The man nodded. Maybe we could switch to you? We don't seem to have that big a age difference. Nicholas Smith agreed to the girl's suggestion and returned to his borscht. Sarah Miller smirked. She had never seen a man who didn't want to talk. One day, Sarah Miller was walking around the village. Nicholas Smith hadn't visited her for a long time, and she assumed he had gotten tired of her. She went for a walk to clear her head, and somewhere deep down, she hoped she would meet Nicholas Smith on the way. For some reason, she really wanted to see him again. She had become so used to his strange silence that she almost missed it. The only thing the girl met in the village was men running back and forth. They were talking about something. Sarah Miller approached Valerie, who had come out of the shop and was looking anxiously somewhere in the distance. Mrs. Valerie, what happened? The woman put her hand to her face. Well, Nicholas Smith's farm is falling apart. Something's wrong there, some problems. Our men and women are quite upset. They might be left without work. And where else can you find work in our village? Oh, what a disaster. Nicholas Smith always barely kept afloat, managed as best he could, and now something has gone completely wrong. Sarah Miller frowned and looked into the distance. Could you tell me the way to Nicholas Smith's farm? Valerie explained how to get to Nicholas Smith to his workplace. His farm was at the very end of the village. It was a large, long building from which the lowing of cows could be heard. Here and there, women in aprons were walking and carrying buckets. There were men in the backyard. Behind the farm were large gardens. Now, in mid-autumn, they were empty. Sarah Miller asked a passing woman where Nicholas Smith's office was and went there. The man's office was small, even tiny. In the middle stood a desk and a chair, in the corner a wardrobe and a small window in the wall through which crumbs of light entered. Nicholas Smith himself stood in the middle of the office, bent over papers. He was saying something with his lips, calculating on a calculator, and making corrections to documents. Sarah Miller approached closer. Nicholas Smith, hello? The man turned sharply and sighed. Something broken again? He asked. Sorry, now is not the best time. No, Sarah Miller replied. I heard you have problems. I came to help. Something with the documents? Everything's fine. I'll manage, the man said a little roughly. She walked closer and almost pushed Nicholas Smith aside, taking hold of the papers. The man exhaled loudly. Go away, or I'll have to physically remove you. Sarah Miller raised her hand and looked closely. She only glanced at the papers, but she already saw huge sums and excessive expenses that were simply unnecessary for this small place, compared to the city. Do you even have an accountant or a finance specialist? I'm handling everything myself, Nicholas Smith repeated. I see how you're handling it. Fabulous expenses going nowhere. You urgently need a specialist. And where am I supposed to get one? Nicholas Smith asked, frowning. Sarah Miller smiled broadly and pointed to herself. I'm an economist by education. Besides, I worked for several years at a firm where the expenses and income were clearly much larger than yours. Nicholas Smith waved his hand and sat down wearily on the chair, leaving Sarah Miller with the papers. Late in the evening, when it was already dark, Nicholas Smith and Sarah Miller left his office. The farm was empty, the workers had cleaned up and locked everything. Are you sure that if you remove these expenses, nothing will change? Why do you need both cold storage and milk delivery 3 times a day? One is enough, it will be taken away, and the rest of the time it will be stored in the refrigerator. There's no point in running cars and spending a huge amount of money on it. And it's the same with many expenses. The estimates are very poorly drawn up. Nicholas Smith scratched the back of his head in confusion. I was a military man, you know. I'm far from estimates, accounting. My father always dreamed of having his own big farm and fields, but I decided to fulfill his dream, even if it's late. Late? He died? Thank God, no. He got seriously ill. I had to put him in a special facility. Otherwise, I just couldn't cope with him. So I had to raise the farm from its knees. Sarah Miller looked sympathetically at Nicholas Smith, walking along the narrow path. It was cool outside, the wind was blowing, but at the same time, it seemed like it couldn't be better. So calm and quiet. "So, what's the story with the stroke?" Nicholas Smith asked unexpectedly. Sarah Miller flinched. At first, she wanted to make a joke, but then she remembered that she had promised to tell him. Exhaling loudly, she began her story. "That's when I came up with that plan." She remembered the conversation with the detective. Sarah Miller and Kathy helped put it into action. She found a doctor who, for a small fee, agreed to say I had a stroke and would die soon. They believed it quickly, as if without thinking and expecting it. It was terrible. The 3 weeks I lived with my husband and mother-in-law completely extinguished any pity or sympathy I had for him. I became forgotten and unwanted, and when he brought me here, I realized this was the end. Nicholas Smith took the girl's hand and squeezed it tightly. Sarah Miller looked at the hand the man was holding and nodded in thanks for the support. "Why don't you go back to the city?" "At first I just wanted to calm down and wait a bit, but then I realized that I didn't want to go back there. It's such a fast pace, constant rushing. Besides, it's another reminder of Davy and his mom." Nicholas Smith released the girl's hand and sped up. "Let's go. I'll show you something." They walked for a long time. Sarah Miller didn't know where. However, when they arrived, she gasped in surprise. The man led her to a huge, luxurious house with a high fence. "This is the house of a friend of mine. We served together. He recently died of cancer. Now they're selling the house. And I don't want them to. I wish I could buy it, but as you know, I don't have the money. They're going to buy the house to demolish it and build something like a sawmill here, or I don't even know. You understand? If you buy this house, there'll be no turning back." "I don't want to go back to the city. For the village, I'm too fast, impatient. For the city, I'm too slow. It's such a paradox. Here I can achieve something, but not there." Sarah Miller's gaze settled on the man's stern face, on his eyes looking hopefully at the house, on his tightly pressed lips, and on the wrinkles on his forehead that appeared when Nicholas Smith was thinking about something serious. A determined spark ignited in Sarah Miller's eyes. She squeezed Nicholas Smith's hand, just as he had done a few minutes ago, and smiled. "You'll definitely succeed. I'll help. We'll raise the farm, and you'll be what your father dreamed of. I promise." Nicholas Smith said nothing again, but the hope flickering in his eyes made her happy. He believed in the best. Nicholas Smith and Sarah Miller began working together. She helped him raise the farm, create new working conditions. They bought new livestock and equipment. Profit began to appear not only on paper. The man was very happy about this. He gave the girl flowers several times as a sign of gratitude, and the tradition of fixing Sarah Miller's house also returned. He would come almost every morning, and she would cook breakfast. This was their ritual. A few weeks after the walk, Catherine came to the girl and brought documents. "Are you sure?" she asked her friend. "More than," Sarah Miller replied and took the folder. "There's no turning back," Catherine repeated Sarah Miller's own words. "I know, and I'm ready to take the risk." Catherine remained silent, not wanting to argue with her friend. After what had happened, she tried to support her in all her endeavors. Sarah Miller hugged the documents to her chest and headed towards the farm. More equipment was supposed to arrive today, so the girl hurried as fast as she could. Besides, she had joyful news. Sarah Miller found Nicholas Smith as usual in his office. He was sitting at his desk writing something. At the sight of the girl, he smiled and brightened up. "You're early," he said, pulling out a chair for Sarah Miller. The girl sat down at the desk and placed the papers. "Read this." Nicholas Smith took the folder and began to slowly leaf through the papers. With each page, his eyes grew wider and wider. The girl watched his reaction with hidden fear and anticipation. Closing the folder, Nicholas Smith put it on the desk and lowered his eyes to the girl. "What have you done?" he asked hoarsely. "Did you buy the house?" Sarah Miller looked at him sadly and sipped her tea. There was a knock at the door. Catherine entered wearing a tight blue dress. She looked directly at David Miller and smirked. "Well, did you tell him everything? Too bad I couldn't see his face. I'm a little late." So you knew everything? David Miller roared. Catherine smirked. That was my doctor, whom I paid for the diagnosis. Did you really think Sal pulled all this off alone? She loved you too much to do that. But you broke her heart, decided you could treat her like garbage. David Miller pursed his lips. You don't know anything. Sal, I love you. Sal? Sarah Miller raised her eyebrows and smirked. And Lily, does she no longer suit you, or couldn't she wait for you to open your business and shower her with gifts? David Miller opened his mouth to object but fell silent at the last moment, realizing that excuses were pointless. But how dare you play such a trick on Mom and me? David Miller asked. She was so upset when she found out you were sick. Catherine and Sarah Miller exchanged glances and laughed. Eleanor Miller was running ahead of everyone, shouting with joy that her daughter-in-law was sick and would soon kick the bucket. She was waiting for my inheritance more than you were. David Miller looked around the house, then smiled broadly. Did you buy and earn all this while married to me? Catherine frowned, understanding what her friend's husband was getting at. She wanted to object to him, but he opened his mouth again. And since you acquired this during our marriage, half of the property is mine, right? Catherine was a lawyer. She knew the law perfectly well and how such situations ended. Sarah Miller stood up from the armchair and glared angrily at her husband, wanting to tell him everything she thought of him. But at that moment the door opened, and the very man from the car that had cut off David Miller entered. Hi, Nick, Catherine nodded and whispered something in the man's ear. He turned to David Miller with a very serious, enraged face. It seemed almost impossible to stop him. He advanced on the man. David Miller swallowed in fear and began to back away. Get out. If you idiot decide to threaten Sal, I'll make your life hell. Nicholas Smith said roughly, grabbed David Miller by the scruff of the neck and threw him out of the room. Catherine, Sarah Miller, and Nicholas Smith heard the front door slam. David Miller was walking away from the house quickly. Why did you let him in? Nicholas Smith asked Sarah Miller, coming closer and hugging her from behind. In front of her husband, she had held herself together, not wanting to show weakness, but everyone in the room knew how hard she had taken her husband's betrayal. The girl stood with her head lowered, holding back the urge to cry. I had to tell him everything, the girl said. I needed to see his face when he realized my inheritance wasn't coming to him. Did that make you feel better? Catherine asked. Sarah Miller nodded and wrapped herself tighter in Nicholas Smith's strong and reliable embrace. I'm filing for divorce tomorrow. Despite Nicholas Smith's threats, David Miller still decided to sue for divorce with property division. From a legal standpoint, he was right. If he had claimed the inheritance, he would have been wrong. But the girl had bought the house and leased the fields, the income from which is considered jointly acquired property. The court notification arrived by mail. Nicholas Smith brought it with the other documents and handed it to the girl grimly. When Sarah Miller opened the envelope and read the court summons, she turned pale in a second and sat down wearily on the sofa. She was all dirty and dusty, having just come from the fields, but she didn't care. She hadn't thought David Miller would actually sue for property division. However, she had also thought he wouldn't abandon her to die. He turned out to be a very unpredictable person. We need a good lawyer, Nicholas Smith said, picking up the notification. Kathy, Sarah Miller said. She heads the legal department of the firm. She has a license to handle cases. I think she can help us. Besides, we don't need to tell her our story. Nicholas Smith sat down next to the girl. Listen, I looked in the bathroom after you yesterday, and... Sarah Miller looked at the man in fright. I don't know what to say, and I found a test there. Are you pregnant? Sarah Miller nodded. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought you'd be against it, and... A soft kiss interrupted the girl. She hugged the man and smiled broadly. So you're not against it? The joyful smile, the man's mischievous eyes, answered better than any words. He hugged the girl tightly and pulled her close. If that scoundrel suddenly decides to sue you for half the property, I don't care. We won't be left with nothing. We'll have our house, the fields, the child, and each other. We'll have each other. Sarah Miller closed her eyes and took a deep breath. But when she opened them, Nicholas Smith saw the look that had once frightened the detective. It was a determined and unwavering gaze. He went to court to take from me what belongs to me by blood, but he will leave there with nothing, I will take not only what is mine, but everything he has. He will be left with nothing. The court case took place very soon, as if the universe itself wanted to finish with this strange matter quickly. Catherine became Sarah Miller's lawyer. Nicholas Smith supported the girl from the witness bench, as did many villagers. The judge was a tall, red-haired woman with a stern gaze. She listened to the plaintiff David Miller's statement with boredom, asking him clarifying questions that he couldn't always answer. It seemed to amuse her. The witnesses for the plaintiff were Eleanor Miller, neighbors, and David Miller's friends. They all spoke only ill of the girl. Eleanor Miller even went on, as if for the last time putting on her full dramatic performance. I was so scared when Sally, and when she had a stroke, I didn't sleep for 3 nights, waiting for news from the hospital. Tears streamed from the woman's eyes. She wiped them with a white handkerchief and continued. And when I saw Sally, I almost had a heart attack myself. She wasn't moving, she was almost lifeless. I had to look after her while Davy worked. I cleaned up after her, fed her, and she turned out not to be sick. The worst thing I could ever experience has already happened to me. My son and I have been betrayed, deceived, and now they want to leave us with nothing. Eleanor Miller cried once more and sat back down on the bench. After her speech, the judge seemed to become more invested in the case and listened to the other witnesses with interest. Your Honor, the plaintiff's and his witnesses' words should not be trusted. Let's start with the fact that the defendant has evidence of the plaintiff's infidelity. The recording is attached to the case. The recording of Lily Johnson's and David Miller's conversation boomed throughout the courtroom. Then the detective testified as a witness, talking about the plaintiff's relationship. Lie! Eleanor Miller jumped up from the bench, but after the judge's warning, she sat back down. She seemed deeply distressed by the slander. Furthermore, I would like to note that the defendant did not deceive the plaintiff legally. She merely pretended to be sick to test him. No medical certificates were provided. The doctor only verbally gave the patient's diagnosis to the plaintiff and his mother, and the plaintiff's side claims they cared for the sick defendant, Catherine continued. However, I have a recording of citizen Eleanor Miller, daughter of Ignat's conversation with her son. I request it be played. Yes, Davy, feed her. Oh, I got carried away reading, completely forgot. But it's okay, she can wait until lunch, she won't lose any weight. How are you doing there? Did you find a caretaker for her? Good. The main thing is she charges little, and the fact that she drinks is no big deal. The doctor said she wouldn't last long anyway. The conversation was turned off, and the room gasped in surprise. Catherine continued. Furthermore, the plaintiff filed a claim for the division of the following property: a residential house at Willow Creek Village, Elm Lane Street, House 8, as well as income from the fields of the Golden Birch Firm, which were indeed purchased by citizen Sarah Miller, daughter of Victor, that is the defendant, but this property was already transferred to the full ownership of citizen Nicholas Smith, son of Peter, a week before the claim was filed. Consequently, the property was acquired during the marriage and transferred also during the marriage. Therefore, the plaintiff cannot demand its division. The remaining money in the defendant's personal account and the share in the estate in Germany are part of the inheritance, which the plaintiff also has no right to claim. The judge smirked. She did it almost imperceptibly, but Sarah Miller was ready to swear. She looked at David Miller with a hint of satisfaction. To transfer the property to Nicholas Smith's ownership, they had to put in effort and find a corrupt notary who backdated the transaction. This greatly helped the case. Well then, in this way, is the claim considered invalid? The judge asked Catherine. The claim of plaintiff David Miller, son of Michael, is aimed at an equal division of property between the former spouses, but this includes not only the defendant's property, but also the plaintiff's own property, namely, a 3-room apartment at Maple Street, House 24, third entrance, apartment 33, a BMW car, as well as the money in the joint account of the plaintiff and the defendant. I object. David Miller's lawyer, a full old man with a bald head and round glasses, jumped up. The apartment is the plaintiff's inheritance from his father, correct? Correct, Catherine nodded. But according to the law, if one spouse has made significant changes to the other spouse's property, it can be recognized as joint property. And what significant changes were made? The lawyer asked. Now on the screen, Your Honor, you will see photos of the apartment before its renovation. As you can see, it was in adequate condition. This was exactly 1 year after the wedding, And here are photos of the apartment after renovation, 6 months later. How will you prove that this was done with the defendant's money? Firstly, during the period from September to April, when the renovation took place, the plaintiff was not working, and according to the bank statement, there was not the necessary amount of money in his personal account. Furthermore, the testimony of the foreman of the team that did the renovation is attached to the case. The contract was signed on behalf of the defendant. The lawyers argued for a long time, called witnesses, and tried to prove their point of view, but soon the judge retired to make a decision. She returned with a large red folder. "All rise, court is in session," the judge's assistant said. The court issued a decision to grant the plaintiff's claim. The property of David Miller, son of Michael, will be divided between him and his wife. The defendant will receive a third of the apartment, the car will become joint property, and 50% of the money from the plaintiff's account will become the property of Sarah Miller, daughter of Victor. The court's decision is final and not subject to appeal. The bang of the gavel settled everything. David Miller and Eleanor Miller looked at Sarah Miller, whom Nicholas Smith was hugging, with malice and hatred. Catherine, smiling broadly, joined them. "I told you we'd take everything from him," the girl said in a slightly strange, even obsessed voice. "It's rightfully yours, not his," Nicholas Smith breathed out. "Understood? Now we have everything we dreamed of." The man smiled. "All that's left is to have a child, and the house will be full," Catherine said, gathering her papers. "Well," Sarah Miller said, looking at her stomach. Catherine smiled. "Quick work, certainly. Will you take me as godmother?" "Do we have a choice?" Nicholas Smith asked. "None." Sarah Miller smiled and hugged the two dearest people in her life again. Now everything would definitely be fine for her.